The cold wind swept through the colony outpost on Vega 4, rattling the metal shutters of the abandoned command post. The place had once been a thriving settlement, a beacon of human expansion, but now it was little more than a battered ghost town under the heel of the Zervax Imperium. Smoke still lingered in the air from a first assault, the acrid stench of burned-out vehicles and collapsed buildings settling over the desolate remains. Captain Mark Reynolds crouched behind the wreckage of a transport truck, his pulse steady as he watched the enemy patrol move through the ruined streets. 5 Zervax soldiers, their elongated, insectoid forms clad in shimmering exoskeletal armor, moved with the confidence of conquerors. Their plasma rifles glowed faintly in the dimming sunlight, weapons built on the certainty that no human technology could possibly stand against them. The arrogance was infuriating. A whisper crackled through the comms. "They're fanning out. We taking them or letting them pass?" Sergeant James Jim Holloway asked, his voice level but edged with restrained aggression. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. His team had been watching the Zervax forces since their arrival, carefully noting their movements, their weaknesses, what few there were. The alien empire had swept into the system with all the superiority of a civilization that had never known real war. Their starships, their energy weapons, their battlefield shields, everything about them was designed to dominate. And for the first few days, they had. Vega 4 had fallen in less than 72 hours. The local militia had been vaporized in the first assault, their standard-issue railguns and explosives proving useless against the Zervax's shimmering energy barriers. The colony's automated defenses had been overrun in minutes. The survivors had fled into the hills, a handful of trained soldiers and engineers forming the last vestiges of resistance. Now, scattered and outgunned, they were little more than an irritation to the occupying force. "Let them pass," Reynolds finally murmured. "Not yet." The enemy patrol drifted further down the ruined street, their movements sluggish with overconfidence. Holloway exhaled sharply, clearly displeased but disciplined enough to hold his fire. Beside him, Corporal David Ortiz tapped a gloved finger against the barrel of his carbine, eyes scanning the patrol with quiet calculation. The weapons engineer had been uncharacteristically silent since they'd gone into hiding, his mind clearly working through something. They remained still until the enemy disappeared into the distance, the eerie quiet of the abandoned colony settling over them once more. Only then did Private Alan Brooks shift uncomfortably, adjusting the strap of his rifle. The youngest of the group, he had the look of a man trying to disguise his nerves. "This isn't working," Ortiz said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "We're not going to win this playing hide-and-seek." Reynolds gave him a look, waiting. "You saw what happened last time. Our rounds bounce off their shields. Our explosives barely scratch their armor. We're shooting pebbles at a goddamn starship." Reynolds already knew all of this, but he let the words settle among them. They had tested every trick they had, ambushes, traps, makeshift EMPs, but nothing had turned the tide. The Zervax were too advanced, too well prepared for primitive resistance. Brooks shifted again. "So what do we do? Lay down and die?" "No," Ortiz said. "We think old school." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Ortiz glanced around, then motioned for them to follow. He led them through the ruins, past shattered storefronts and charred vehicles, until they reached a crumbling warehouse near the colony's old industrial sector. He pried open a rusted hatch in the floor, revealing a staircase leading into the darkness below. "We were cataloging old supply caches before the invasion," Ortiz said as they descended. "Most of it was standard colony equipment, but then we found this." The underground chamber was filled with crates stamped with faded U.S. military insignias. Reynolds ran a hand over one, brushing away the dust. "Pre-colony era," Ortiz explained. "Stuff left behind when they first settled this rock." He pried open a container and stepped back. Inside, resting under decades-old tarp, was an M40 recoilless rifle. Reynolds stared at it. The weapon was a relic, a piece of 20th century firepower long considered obsolete. But as he looked at it now, something shifted in his mind. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," Ortiz said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "That depends," Reynolds replied. "Are you thinking about how kinetic rounds don't give a damn about energy shields?" Ortiz patted the side of the weapon. "Exactly. Plasma shields, for all their technological brilliance, were designed to dissipate directed energy attacks. They could absorb railgun impacts, deflect high-velocity projectiles, and scramble targeting systems. But they weren't built to counter a solid, high-explosive shell moving at just under the speed of sound." Reynolds knelt, running his hand along the M40's barrel. "How much ammo do we have?" "Enough," Ortiz answered. "Some heat rounds, a few modified shells. We'll need to test them, maybe tweak a few things. But if this works—" "It'll work," Holloway muttered. "Old-school American firepower. Should have known." Reynolds rose, his mind already moving ahead, forming the plan. This wasn't a victory yet, not even close. But for the first time since the invasion, they had something the Zervacs weren't expecting. "You said it yourself, Jim," Reynolds said, looking at the weapon. "We're not going to win this playing hide-and-seek." The team stood in the dim light of the bunker, surrounded by crates of forgotten weaponry. Outside, the Empire continued its slow, systematic conquest, oblivious to the fact that deep within the ruins, humanity had just found its answer. Reynolds exhaled. "Let's see how the bastards like a real fight." The rifle lay disassembled across the steel workbench, its thick barrel and breech open to scrutiny under the dim glow of an overhead lamp. Corporal David Ortiz wiped sweat from his brow, carefully adjusting the alignment of a modified sighting system scavenged from a destroyed Zervax drone. The optics, designed for an entirely different kind of weapon, would need calibration, but it was a start. "You sure this relic can still fire?" Private Alan Brooks asked, leaning against a stack of supply crates. His skepticism wasn't unwarranted. The M40 was ancient by any military standard, its origins stretching back to wars fought on Earth before humanity even dreamed of reaching the stars. Against the technology of the Zervax Imperium, it seemed almost laughable. "It's a cannon, Brooks," Ortiz muttered, not looking up. "It doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to hit like a freight train." Captain Mark Reynolds crossed his arms, watching as Ortiz worked. "The Zervacs underestimated us because they think war is about technology. They think energy shields make them untouchable." He gestured to the rifle. "We're about to remind them what happens when you bet against human ingenuity." Sergeant Jim Holloway knelt beside an open crate, running his fingers along the smooth casing of an old heat round. These babies were designed to punch through Cold War armor. "I bet my last bullet they'll do the same to those bug bastards." Reynolds glanced toward the entrance of their hideout, a reinforced sublevel of an abandoned mining station. They had relocated after retrieving the M40, dragging every usable crate of ammunition and spare parts with them. The Zervax patrols were tightening their hold on the colony, and it was only a matter of time before the Empire realized the scattered resistance wasn't as broken as they thought. "How long before it's operational?" Reynolds asked. Ortiz tightened the last bolt on the rifle's mount before stepping back. "It's operational now, but we won't know if it actually works until we fire it." Holloway grinned, slapping the side of the weapon. "Well, let's find out." They moved to a reinforced tunnel carved into the side of a nearby ridge, a spot they had marked earlier for testing. Ortiz set up the rifle on a bipod, carefully aligning the modified optics while Brooks prepared the first round. The young private hesitated only for a moment before loading the shell into the breech with an audible clank. Reynolds knelt beside the rifle, taking in its design. It was crude by comparison to modern weapons, but that was its advantage. No electronic systems for the Zervacs to disrupt, no plasma coils to overheat, no energy-dependent functions that could be neutralized by their tech. Just raw kinetic power. He steadied his aim at a wrecked Zervax patrol vehicle in the valley below, its ruined hull still smoldering from a previous skirmish. Adjusting for distance, he let out a slow breath before squeezing the trigger. The M40 roared. The recoil kicked back hard, dust billowing from the ground as the shell tore through the air. A split second later, the wrecked vehicle exploded in a fireball of shattered metal and flame. "Jesus," Brooks muttered, blinking at the devastation. Holloway let out a low whistle. "Now that's firepower." Ortiz was already making adjustments, checking the sighting system and recalibrating for trajectory. "We need to be precise when we take the shot for Real. This thing isn't exactly rapid fire." Reynolds lowered the rifle, staring at the burning wreck below. The test was successful, but they would only have one real chance to use it before the Zervax adapted. The Empire's arrogance had given them this opportunity, but that advantage wouldn't last. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Reynolds said, turning back to the team. "Hard, fast, and without warning. Once they realize what we're using, they'll adapt. We have to make the first strike count." Brooks cracked his knuckles, shaking off the lingering shock of the weapon's sheer destructive force. "So what's the target?" Reynolds reached into his pack, pulling out a small hollow projector. The device flickered to life, displaying an overhead view of the colony's outskirts. He zoomed in on a ridge where a series of Zervax war machines were stationed, their massive quadrupedal forms equipped with plasma cannons and shield generators. "Their war walkers are controlling the main supply routes," he said. "They're too big to navigate the colony's ruins, so they stay near the open roads. If we take them out, we cripple their ability to reinforce their troops." Ortiz studied the projection. "Their shielding won't mean anything once the round hits, but we'll need a clean shot. If we miss, we don't get a second chance." Holloway cracked his neck, his usual smirk settling into something colder. "Then we don't miss." Reynolds shut off the projector. The plan was set. The M40 was ready, and for the first time since the invasion began, the Zervax were about to learn what it meant to underestimate humanity. The ridge overlooked the valley, its jagged outcroppings providing natural cover against the metallic sprawl of the Zervax encampment below. The alien war walkers stood like mechanical sentinels, their towering forms bathed in the eerie blue glow of shield projectors, humming with pulsing energy. Each of the massive quadrupedal machines bristled with plasma cannons, their movements slow but methodical as they scanned the roads leading into the occupied settlement. Captain Mark Reynolds adjusted his position, keeping low behind the uneven terrain. A cold wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying the acrid scent of burning wreckage from earlier skirmishes. The sky was darkening, the twin suns of Vega, for dipping below the horizon, casting the world in shifting shadows. Sergeant Jim Holloway lay beside him, peering through binoculars. 3 walkers in formation. Center one has the main shield generator. Take it out, and the other 2 lose their defenses. He lowered the binoculars, his expression grim. "We miss. We're dead before we can reload." Reynolds already knew that. The M40 recoilless rifle was a devastating weapon, but it wasn't fast. Once they fired, the Zervax would respond immediately. The team had planned for that, but planning and execution were 2 different things. Corporal David Ortiz knelt beside the weapon, making final adjustments to the scope. Wind steady. Distance locked. Heat round is chambered. He exhaled through his nose. "We only get one shot at this." Private Alan Brooks swallowed hard, shifting his grip on his rifle. "Then we make it count." His voice lacked the bravado from earlier. He was young, but not stupid. He knew what was at stake. Reynolds steadied himself, taking position behind the rifle. The weight of the weapon was familiar now, its crude yet reliable mechanics a stark contrast to the sleek, over-engineered technology of the enemy. He lined up the shot, the crosshairs fixed on the war walker's central shield generator, a pulsating node of concentrated energy. If the round struck true, The entire shield matrix would collapse in an instant. He exhaled slowly, finger tightening on the trigger. The M40 roared, its deep, concussive blast shattering the night. The recoil punched into Reynolds' shoulder, dust and gravel kicking up around them. The heat round streaked through the air, a fiery projectile cutting across the battlefield in a perfect arc. Impact. The explosion consumed the War Walker's midsection in a violent eruption of fire and metal. A shock wave rippled outward, the shield generator failing in a brilliant cascade of energy discharge. The two remaining walkers staggered as their protective barriers collapsed, their once impenetrable defenses reduced to nothing. Direct hit. Ortiz shouted, already reaching for another round. The Zervacs reacted instantly. Alarm klaxons blared from the encampment, their alien voices screeching in untranslatable urgency. Plasma turrets swiveled, locking onto their position. The two remaining War Walkers adjusted their stances, their cannons charging with the sickly blue glow. Move! Reynolds barked, rolling away as the ridge erupted in a hail of plasma fire. The spot where they had just been turned into molten slag, the air sizzling with residual heat. Holloway was already dragging Brooks toward a secondary position, while Ortiz hauled the M40 off its bipod. The weapon was heavy, but they had planned for this. An old transport sled scavenged from the ruins allowed them to drag it without slowing down too much. More Zervacs forces were mobilizing below. Infantry units, their insectoid frames moving with terrifying speed, scrambled into defensive formations. The two remaining War Walkers repositioned, their cannons adjusting for precision fire. That shot got their attention. Brooks gasped, barely keeping pace as they sprinted toward cover. Good, Reynolds growled. Let's make sure they regret it. They reached a secondary ridge, one that offered less height, but better concealment. Ortiz wasted no time resetting the M40, slamming another round into the breach. "Give me a target," he snapped. Holloway risked a glance through his binoculars. Left Walker. Lower joint on the front leg. Take it out, and it's going down hard. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He took aim, adjusting for movement. The War Walker was turning, bringing its cannons to bear. He fired. The round struck the leg joint with pinpoint accuracy. The explosion sheared through the metal plating, severing hydraulic lines in a burst of flame. The War Walker let out a guttural, mechanical shriek as it lurched sideways, unable to maintain balance. Its massive frame toppled, crashing into the ground with a thunderous impact. Brooks let out a whoop before a plasma blast screamed past his head, forcing him to duck. One left. Holloway shouted over the chaos. The final War Walker hesitated, its targeting system recalibrating in the face of an attack it clearly hadn't been programmed to counter. The Zervacs infantry, however, had no such delay. Scores of them were now charging up the ridgeline, their rifles spewing bolts of burning energy. "Time to go," Ortiz yelled, already detaching the M40's mount. Reynolds grabbed Brooks by the collar, shoving him toward the fallback route. Plasma fire rained down around them, turning solid rock into glowing embers. The air was thick with heat, the stench of charred metal and burning ozone filling their lungs. The transport sled jolted as Ortiz and Holloway pulled it behind them, the M40 bouncing against the uneven ground. Their escape route led into a narrow canyon, pre-selected as their best chance to evade pursuit. A plasma bolt clipped Brooks' shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground with a pained grunt. "Brooks is hit!" Holloway shouted, skidding to a stop. Reynolds didn't slow. He grabbed Brooks, throwing the younger soldier's arm over his shoulder. "Move!" They reached the canyon's entrance, disappearing into the rocky passage, just as the Zervacs' forces crested the ridge behind them. Plasma bolts continued to fire, but the natural rock formations shielded them from most of the shots. They ran. The Zervacs would pursue. There was no question of that. But they had done what they came to do. 2 War Walkers were down. The enemy was shaken. And now, the resistance had momentum. The canyon wall stretched high above them, their jagged edges casting deep shadows across the narrow path. The team moved quickly, the weight of the M40 recoilless rifle slowing them, but not enough to stop them. Plasma fire rained down sporadically from the ridge, but the Zervacs couldn't get a clear line of sight. They weren't built for this kind of pursuit. Their strength was in overwhelming force, in crushing opposition with superior firepower. But they weren't used to a fight like this, an enemy that struck from the dark and vanished before retaliation could land. Captain Mark Reynolds adjusted his grip on Private Alan Brooks, who gritted his teeth against the pain of the plasma burn seared across his shoulder. The wound was bad, but he was still on his feet. That was enough for now. "Keep moving," Reynolds ordered, his voice steady. "We're not out of this yet." Sergeant Jim Holloway pulled ahead, his rifle ready as they neared the canyon's exit. Corporal David Ortiz kept pace beside him, the M40's transport sled rattling against the uneven ground. Their retreat wasn't a rout, it was calculated. Every step taken was part of the plan, leading the Zervacs into terrain they had no business fighting in. Holloway stopped suddenly, raising a fist. The team froze. A faint rumble echoed through the canyon, distinct from the distant explosions and weapons fire. The sound was heavy, metallic. It wasn't the Zervacs infantry. It was something bigger. "War Walker," Holloway muttered. Reynolds didn't curse. He didn't have to. They all knew what it meant. The last surviving walker had circled around, cutting off their exit. The Zervacs had adapted quicker than expected. That was the risk of any fight. You hit hard enough, and the enemy learned. But humans learned too. Ortiz dropped to one knee, unstrapping the M40. "Give me 60 seconds, he said, his hands already moving with precise efficiency. "Not gonna get 60, Holloway said grimly, pointing toward the canyon mouth. The War Walker emerged, its towering frame barely squeezing through the rock formations. Its plasma cannons whirred, locking onto them. The Zervacs weren't playing games anymore. One concentrated blast, and the canyon would become their tomb. Reynolds let go of Brooks and took position. "Buy him time," he ordered, raising his rifle. Holloway and Brooks didn't hesitate. They opened fire, their bullets pinging harmlessly against the War Walker's thick plating. The Zervacs knew small arms fire wouldn't do anything. That was why they advanced without caution. They thought this was already over. Reynolds fired at the Walker sensor cluster, the impact briefly disrupting its targeting. The machine hesitated, its cannons momentarily thrown off. Not much, but enough. Ortiz slammed the heat round into place. "Ready." Reynolds didn't wait. "Fire." The M40 roared one last time. The shell streaked forward, straight into the Walker's exposed side. The explosion was instant, metal and fire consuming the machine's midsection. It swayed violently, one leg giving out as the blast tore through its stabilizers. For a moment, it seemed to hang in place, its towering frame teetering. Then gravity took hold. The Walker collapsed, crashing against the canyon wall before slamming into the ground. A cloud of dust and debris shot outward, obscuring the battlefield. The silence that followed was deafening. Reynolds kept his weapon raised, waiting. The War Walker didn't move. Its limbs twitched, sparks flickering from ruined joints, but it was done. A slow exhale passed through the team. They had won. Holloway chuckled, shaking his head. Hope the bugs enjoyed that. Ortiz patted the M40. "Hell of a weapon." Brooks, still leaning against the canyon wall, let out a weak laugh. "You think they'll learn their lesson?" Reynolds watched the wreckage for another moment before turning away. "Doesn't matter. We'll just teach them again." The fight wasn't over. The war wasn't won. But tonight, the Empire had learned a truth they would never forget. Humans didn't need the most advanced weapons. They just needed the right one.